What if the place you trusted most, the sanctuary where prayers echoed and candles burned, was never holy at all? What if the hymns that drifted through the night were nothing more than a mask, concealing whispers of sin, exploitation, and blood? Somewhere in the rolling countryside of 19th century America, a building rose that promised salvation, but delivered something unspeakable. The family who owned it, the Hudsons, were known as pillars of faith, their name etched into sermons and charity. But behind those doors, beneath stained glass and scripture, lay a world of forbidden rituals, forbidden pleasures, and disappearances no one dared to record. Why was this truth buried? Why did the townspeople fall silent? And why, even now, does the story of the Hudson family's church-turned house of sin feel like a wound history tried to erase? Tonight we pull back the curtain, and what you hear may change everything. You thought you knew about faith, power, and the people who pretend to guard it. The Hudson family were not like other families who lived in their town. To understand their shadowed legacy, one has to step into the heart of 19th century America, when power was not only measured by wealth, but by how seamlessly one could blend faith and respectability into a public mask. In that era, small towns were stitched together by churches, not banks or courthouses. Religion was the currency of trust, and those who appeared godly were often placed beyond suspicion. It was in this fertile ground that the Hudsons sowed their influence, carefully crafting an image of sanctity while quietly constructing an empire that thrived in silence and shadows. They did not arrive suddenly. Their name was already respected, their estate already prominent, but they longed for something more permanent than money. Wealth could vanish, but reputation, if carefully built, could survive for generations. The Hudsons knew this better than anyone. They presented themselves as generous benefactors, donating to causes, extending kindness to neighbors, always in full view of the community. To many they seemed the model of virtue, but every carefully orchestrated act of kindness was only a brick in the fortress of deception they were building. The family's influence stretched wider than most townsfolk realized. They held interests in trade, controlled pieces of land that fed the local economy, and funded smaller enterprises that depended on their favor. This meant that few dared to speak against them. To cross the Hudsons was not simply to anger a neighbor, it was to risk livelihood, reputation, even survival. Their grip was velvet on the surface, but iron underneath. This duality, the mask of benevolence and the hidden fist, was the essence of their legacy. Families whispered behind closed doors, but those whispers never dared to reach the daylight. The Hudsons had placed themselves so firmly in the public eye as models of morality that to accuse them would be to question the very foundation of the town's trust. This trust was weaponized. When the Hudsons announced they would build a church on the edge of their land, the town did not hesitate to applaud. The gesture was seen as noble, almost saintly. A wealthy family offering to shoulder the cost of a place of worship was a gift beyond measure for a small community that lacked resources of its own. It was accepted without question that their motives were pure. Why would they not be? For years, the family had spoken of virtue, humility, and service. Who could imagine that behind their vision of a sanctuary was something far more calculated? The Hudsons understood the psychology of faith. They knew that a church was not only a place of gathering but a symbol of authority, untouchable and sacred. By placing themselves at the center of spiritual life, they were not merely building a house for God. They were building a fortress for themselves, one that could shield their darker pursuits from suspicion. As the church rose from the ground, stone by stone, the townspeople marveled at the Hudsons' generosity. It was not a modest building but an imposing structure, larger and more ornate than the town had ever expected. Its spire reached toward the sky like a finger of ambition, its stained glass casting colored light that dazzled the congregation. To step inside was to feel the weight of reverence, a carefully constructed stage upon which the Hudsons performed their piety. The family always occupied the front pew, their posture flawless, their eyes lifted heavenward during prayer. To the townsfolk, this was proof of holiness. To the Hudsons, it was theater, each gesture a carefully rehearsed act to strengthen their grip. But there were cracks, faint ones, invisible unless one knew where to look. The church, for all its grandeur, was built not in the town square where everyone could reach it, but on the Hudson property, isolated enough to give them control over who entered and when. This detail was explained away as generosity. They were giving their own land for God's house. Few questioned the subtle power it gave them. The family also retained authority over the clergy who preached there. Ministers came and went, but always those chosen or influenced by the Hudsons themselves, men who never lingered long, whose sermons never strayed far from the themes of obedience, humility, and silence. By weaving themselves into the spiritual fabric of the community, the Hudsons achieved something beyond wealth. They became untouchable. Suspicion that might have fallen on others could never touch them, because to doubt the Hudsons was to doubt the church, and to doubt the church was to risk damnation in the eyes of one's neighbors. The strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. Cloak power in piety, and no one would dare question it. Their empire was not just financial, it was psychological. The Hudsons understood how faith shaped behavior, how guilt and fear could control a population more effectively than threats. They did not need to wield visible weapons. The pulpit itself became their instrument, the rituals of worship their camouflage. They had created a system where the very people who might suspect them were also those most likely to defend them. To accuse the Hudsons was to risk being seen as a heretic, a troublemaker, someone unfit for the tight moral codes of the community. This silent pressure ensured compliance. It also ensured that the family could begin their darker pursuits in plain sight, without fear of consequence. The story of the Hudson family's hidden empire is not merely one of personal ambition, it is a study in how trust can be corrupted, how symbols of faith can be twisted into shields for vice. They were not the first to do this, nor would they be the last. But the precision with which they executed their deception left scars that echoed long after their church crumbled. At its heart, their story reveals the fragility of human trust. A family revered and respected used that very reverence as the foundation of a secret dominion, reminding us that sometimes the most dangerous predators are not those who stand outside the gates, but those who build the gates themselves and hold the keys. The Hudson Church stood as both marvel and mask, a building that from the outside reflected devotion but within concealed something altogether different. To the townspeople, it was an answered prayer, a place where hymns lifted into the rafters, and the flicker of candles warmed the darkness. The walls smelled of fresh-cut wood, the pews polished until they shone, the stained glass windows casting soft halos of blue and crimson across bowed heads. It was a sanctuary, or at least it pretended to be. In reality, the church was nothing more than a carefully constructed stage. The architecture itself was part of the disguise, built to awe and disarm. Its spire reached upward, promising heaven, but the rooms behind the altar told another story. There, away from the eyes of the congregation, curtains hung heavy to blot out the light, and trapdoors led downward into spaces designed not for worship, but for indulgence. By day, the church's rituals unfolded as expected. Sunday mornings were filled with solemn prayers, children in their best clothes fidgeting under the stern gaze of parents, and the Hudson family seated prominently, their faces solemn masks of reverence. The townspeople saw in those mornings the very definition of respectability, and because appearances were everything, suspicion never breached the surface. Yet the very precision with which those services were conducted betrayed their artificiality. Nothing in them rang with the spontaneity of true devotion. The ministers spoke words that felt rehearsed. The Hudsons bowed their heads with a timing so perfect it resembled performance. And indeed it was performance, designed not to nourish faith, but to reinforce control. The real transformation came when daylight faded and the church was locked from the outside world. At night, the pews were pushed aside, creating an open floor, where tables could be set and gatherings could unfold. The altar, draped in cloth, became something more like a stage for unsanctioned acts, and the stained glass that in the morning scattered light like jewels was shrouded by curtains so the night's activities would not betray themselves to wandering eyes. Those who entered after dark were not there to pray. They were merchants, men of influence, and the occasional visitor whose silence could be purchased. They came for pleasures hidden beneath a thin veil of ritual, a place where sins could be committed under the illusion of secrecy. It is said that the Hudsons trafficked in forbidden entertainments. Wine and spirits, expensive and smuggled, flowed freely within those walls long after prohibitionist voices began to rise in nearby towns. Women, some lured by promises of work or protection, were brought inside and made part of the gatherings. Their voices, once lifted in hymns, now twisted into laughter that did not sound entirely free. For some, the church became a trap. Once inside, the Hudsons controlled every aspect of their fate. A young girl cleaning pews by day might find herself compelled to remain after dusk, her role shifting from servant to something far darker. And, should she vanish, no one dared point toward the church for fear of sacrilege. The disguise was effective because it preyed on the very structure of trust. A building that wore the image of holiness could not, in the eyes of most, contain corruption. Those who noticed strange things were quick to second-guess themselves. A traveler passing by might hear music echoing through the walls long after midnight, yet tell himself it must have been choir rehearsal. A woman who caught the faint smell of tobacco and spirits in the churchyard might whisper to her husband, but he would dismiss it, unwilling to believe what belief itself forbade him to consider. To question the church was to risk questioning God, and so silence prevailed. Inside the Hudson Circle, the building became more than a house of sin. It was a symbol of their control. They could bend sacred space into something profane, and no one would stop them. That knowledge, whispered among their closest associates, only deepened their sense of invulnerability. They were untouchable, shielded by the very sanctity they corrupted. For the Hudsons, this was not simply indulgence, but strategy. By using the church as their mask, they ensured that their power would remain cloaked in the very last place anyone would dare to investigate. Details of what happened inside spread only through rumor, yet the consistency of those whispers is telling. Some spoke of masked gatherings where figures cloaked in anonymity drank and made oaths in candlelight. Others claimed that the Hudsons staged elaborate performances, the altar serving as a platform for acts that blurred the line between ritual and debauchery. Whether all of these tales are true is difficult to know, but their persistence suggests a pattern. The church was never what it claimed to be. It was a stage built for control, indulgence, and concealment. Even the architecture seemed complicit. Beneath the pulpit, hidden staircases wound downward into chambers carved into the earth, rooms with velvet-lined walls and locked doors. These spaces were never acknowledged in daylight, but at night they came alive with activity. Records hint at ledgers kept there, accounts written in code that tracked debts, services, and names. What those ledgers contained has never been fully deciphered, but the implication is chilling. The Hudson Church was not only a place of secret indulgence, but also a hub of organized exploitation. And yet, for years, the deception held. The townspeople praised the Hudsons for their generosity, admired their devotion, and brought their children to the very place that concealed such acts. No one wanted to see what was hidden in plain sight. That was the brilliance of the disguise. To cloak sin in sanctity was to ensure silence, for who among the faithful would dare be the first to call the church a house of corruption? Those who harbored doubts buried them deep, fearing not just the Hudsons but the scorn of their neighbors. In a town where reputation was everything, to question the Hudsons was to risk exile, and so the building continued its double life unchecked. The Hudsons, in their arrogance, may have even taken satisfaction in the irony. The very sermons that denounced temptation and sin were delivered from the same pulpit where temptation thrived after dark. The prayers that urged humility were spoken by lips that whispered commands in secret chambers. And the people, too blind or too fearful, never connected the two. The church was a masterpiece of deception, its holiness a cloak that hid a theater of sin. The Hudson family had not merely fooled their town, they had redefined what power meant, proving that the greatest mask of all was the one draped in faith. The late 1800s was a time when America balanced on the edge of transformation. Industry was rising, towns were growing, but in rural regions, life remained tethered to old rhythms, where trust in the familiar outweighed suspicion of the strange. In these communities, the church was not just a place of worship, It was the anchor of social life, the unshakable core around which everything else revolved. Births were blessed at the altar, marriages sanctified beneath stained glass, and deaths mourned within its walls. The church was seen as eternal, a sanctuary immune to corruption. It was into this environment that the Hudson family wove their deception, perfectly timed to exploit the very faith that bound their neighbors together. The year that matters in their story was one of shadows, though no single date can be etched in stone. By the mid to late 19th century, whispers of missing young women began to surface, and they all converged around the Hudson Church. America at that moment was preoccupied with other crises, the scars of the Civil War still raw, westward expansion swallowing entire landscapes, and new inventions promising to reshape the future. In such a restless era, small-town scandals often vanished into obscurity, overshadowed by the enormity of national change. For the Hudsons, this was an opportunity. Their manipulations could thrive precisely because their corner of the world seemed too quiet, too pious to attract scrutiny. The region where they lived was one of rolling farmland, dotted with narrow roads and wooden homesteads that seemed unchanged for generations. Neighbors knew one another by name, gossip flowed more freely than money, and reputations carried more weight than law. In such places, the Hudsons did not need to wield force. They only needed to cultivate an image. The setting itself worked in their favor. The isolation of their church, removed from the crowded heart of town, gave them space for secrecy. The silence of the countryside at night concealed noises that might have raised questions in a city. The very landscape conspired with their deception, granting cover to acts that could never have survived in a busier place. What makes the Hudson story chilling is how ordinary it all appeared. In those years, America was a nation where suspicion often fell on the wandering stranger, the passing drifter, or the foreign immigrant. Danger was expected to come from the outside, from those without ties to the community. The Hudsons understood this prejudice and used it to their advantage. They were insiders, wealthy, land-owning, respected. They hosted town gatherings, gave donations, and stood in the front pew each Sunday. Their very presence reassured the community, creating a blind spot so wide that entire lives could vanish without sparking alarm. The year of shadows, as it has come to be remembered in scattered accounts, was marked by patterns that no one dared piece together aloud. Girls from the poorer edges of town, many without family, disappeared after being seen near the Hudson Church. A hired hand claimed to have glimpsed figures moving inside after midnight, though he quickly retracted his words when pressed by neighbors who warned him to guard his tongue. Another account tells of travelers who avoided the road by the church after dark, unnerved by the strange glow of lanterns and the faint strains of music that carried on the night air. Yet none of these fragments were ever joined into an official record. Fear, reverence, and the weight of reputation buried them before they could form a complete story. It is important to understand the climate of authority in that era. Law enforcement was not the omnipresent force it would later become. A sheriff might cover vast territories, stretched thin and often dependent on local goodwill. To investigate a family as powerful as the Hudsons was to risk losing support, or worse, one's position entirely. In communities where survival often hinged on alliances, few officials were brave enough to pursue suspicions that pointed toward the church. And so silence hardened into complicity. Each passing year allowed the Hudsons to deepen their hold, while those who noticed irregularities consoled themselves with the thought that surely nothing so vile could happen beneath the roof of God's house. But history has a way of leaving traces, even when silence smothers truth. In the years that followed, journals and letters surfaced that spoke indirectly of unease. A mother mentioned her daughter's last visit to the Hudson estate, written with a tone of grief but never accusation. A laborer described the strange gatherings he heard through the night, but wrote them off as drunken festivities he dared not question. These voices, though never raised in their time, form the mosaic through which we now glimpse the outlines of what occurred. They reveal that people sensed something was wrong, yet the climate of the late 19th century offered no safe path to voice those suspicions. The Hudsons thrived in the intersection between faith and fear. The year of shadows was not marked by a single event, but by the steady accumulation of disappearances, whispers, and silences. Each time someone vanished, the story was explained away. She must have run off to the city, she must have married in secret, she must have fallen ill and been taken elsewhere. Explanations multiplied, each more improbable than the last, but always accepted because the alternative was unthinkable. To accuse the Hudson family would be to accuse the church itself, and to accuse the church was to risk standing outside the very community upon which survival depended. In that year, denial became as essential to the townspeople as prayer. This period in American history, marked by upheaval and transition, is also what allowed the Hudson's secret to endure. The nation's gaze was fixed elsewhere, on railroads stretching westward, on factories that billowed smoke into the skies of expanding cities, on political scandals that rocked Washington. In such a context, the fate of a few missing women in a rural community seemed insignificant. The Hudsons understood this imbalance. Their sins were not hidden simply by walls and curtains, but by the enormity of a nation too distracted to care. And so, the year of shadows slipped by, unmarked in official chronicles but heavy in the memories of those who lived it. For the Hudsons, it was a time of triumph, proof that their disguise was effective and their power unshakable. For the community, it was a year that carved silent wounds, grief carried in whispers, doubts swallowed for fear of reprisal. And for history, it became one more example of how easily darkness can thrive when cloaked in the robes of sanctity, and how quickly truth can be buried when the times themselves prefer silence to scandal. The Hudsons mastered the art of performance, and nowhere was this more evident than in the sermons and rituals that unfolded within their church. To the townspeople, every detail appeared sacred: the solemn procession of the minister, the soft hymns that rose and fell like breath, the rustle of pages as Bibles opened in unison. Yet beneath this performance lay a calculated purpose. Every prayer, every gesture, every scripture was chosen not for its spiritual nourishment, but for the power it could reinforce. The Hudsons knew that faith was not just a belief, but a language of control, and they wielded it with precision. By day, the church exuded holiness, filling its congregation with awe and humility. By night, when the masks slipped and the building's true nature emerged, those very rituals were echoed in distorted form, twisted into ceremonies that mocked the faith they pretended to uphold. The sermons themselves reflected this duality. Ministers brought in under Hudson influence spoke of obedience, sacrifice, and the need for trust in leaders. Passages of Scripture emphasizing submission were repeated more often than others, and warnings about questioning authority fell heavily from the pulpit. These were not coincidences. They were reminders, subtle reinforcements of the Hudsons' dominance, ensuring that suspicion never took root among the flock. The family themselves, always seated at the front with heads bowed in flawless rhythm, embodied the image of faithful devotion. Their eyes lifted toward heaven, their lips whispering, prayers, all of it carefully staged. To the casual observer, this display was proof of their sanctity. To those who knew better, it was a shield, faith as theater, piety as disguise. What made their disguise even more effective was the blending of ritual and secrecy. After services ended and families drifted back to their homes, the Hudsons remained behind, locking doors under the guise of safeguarding the building. Those who lingered nearby claimed to hear voices long after the congregation had dispersed. Voices not raised in prayer but in laughter, heated debate, or hushed tones that carried no trace of worship. Still, no one dared to question, to accuse. The Hudsons of duplicity was to accuse the church itself, and few in that community were willing to risk being branded as blasphemers. By night, the church underwent its transformation. The rituals that had seemed holy hours earlier became masks for something darker. Candles were lit again, but their flames burned lower, casting long shadows against velvet curtains drawn across stained glass. Incense gave way to smoke from cigars, and the clink of glasses filled with liquor smuggled in for these private gatherings. The hymns that had filled the air during daylight were replaced with music less structured, less innocent, accompanied by laughter and the shuffle of footsteps across wooden floors cleared of pews. The same altar upon which Scripture had been read now served as a stage for entertainments that bore no resemblance to worship. The Hudsons cloaked these nights in secrecy, but their sense of irony could not be ignored. They deliberately mirrored certain aspects of worship, twisting them into grotesque parodies. Guests were made to swear oaths of silence not unlike vows, but where vows to God demanded purity, these demanded complicity. Wine that had earlier been offered symbolically as the blood of Christ now flowed in excess, stripped of sacred meaning. Acts of indulgence unfolded where prayers had been spoken, each one underscoring the family's belief that the church was theirs to control, to redefine, to desecrate as they pleased. Those invited into this world understood the stakes. To enter. The Hudson Church at night was to cross an invisible line. The building's sanctity outside its walls no longer applied. Once inside, participants surrendered themselves to a realm where the Hudsons ruled without question. The disguise of piety was not only for the town, it was for the participants as well. The power of the setting, the echo of hymns that still seemed to linger in the rafters, lent a sense of legitimacy even to the profane. The Hudsons knew that the environment itself worked to blur boundaries. In a place already deemed holy, even sin seemed to wear a cloak of inevitability. The blending of ritual and secrecy extended further still. The Hudsons' manipulation of faith ensured that even those who suspected could not disentangle truth from blasphemy. A farmer whose daughter disappeared after visiting the church might whisper suspicions to his wife, but to speak them aloud in public was to risk more than shame. It was to risk exile, to stand outside the safety of community life. The Hudsons understood this unspoken threat and cultivated it, ensuring that fear of social ruin worked in their favor. Silence was maintained not through open violence, but through the subtle power of shame. This dual existence, holy by day, corrupt by night, was more than deception. It was strategy. By maintaining an image of absolute devotion, the Hudsons ensured their nights of indulgence remained unassailable. To neighbors, they were models of morality. To those inside their secret circle, they were rulers of a private kingdom built on hypocrisy. Each role fed the other. The disguise of piety shielded the sin, and the sin in turn deepened their need to perfect the disguise. It was a cycle that reinforced itself, each passing year weaving a tighter net of control. But beneath the surface, cracks were inevitable. Servants employed at the church carried fragments of stories they dared not share. A young boy who swept the floors recalled the smell of smoke lingering in the morning, though no incense had been burned during service. A seamstress who mended curtains whispered of fabric worn thin, not from sun or age, but from hands pulling them closed night after night. These fragments alone meant little, but together they formed a shadow of truth. Still, fear ensured that they never solidified into open accusation. The Hudsons' disguise held because the community needed it to hold. To believe otherwise was to shatter the very foundation of their world. This manipulation of faith through performance, through the weaponization of ritual, was perhaps the Hudsons' greatest achievement. They had transformed a tool meant to uplift into one that silenced, turning devotion into complicity. In doing so, they revealed the vulnerability of systems built on unquestioned trust. The church was meant to represent eternal truth, yet in their hands it became a mask that concealed lies. And while the congregation bowed their heads in reverence, the Hudsons smiled behind closed doors, knowing their disguise was working exactly as intended. The Hudsons did not simply build a house and call it a church. They crafted an illusion so convincing that even the most skeptical travelers were momentarily disarmed by its appearance. The structure itself rose from the soil like a grim parody of faith: whitewashed walls, a tall, narrow steeple that pierced the skyline, and heavy oak doors carved with biblical motifs. At a distance, the building seemed to radiate purity. The bell, when struck, released a sound so sweet and solemn that it could draw the weary to its threshold. But closer inspection revealed subtle irregularities, stained glass windows depicting not the traditional saints, but strange, abstract figures that twisted in forms both grotesque and seductive. The paint that seemed bright in daylight peeled under the torchlight, revealing crude rushed carpentry hidden beneath. The Hudsons were meticulous in designing their deception. On Sundays, or whenever visitors might pass, the family would gather in the front hall and mimic a congregation at prayer. Their voices rose together, reciting lines that resembled scripture but contained strange additions, cryptic phrases woven into otherwise familiar verses. To an untrained ear, it was all the same. To anyone who lingered too long, however, there was a faint, unsettling dissonance. They would bow their heads in reverence, but the gleam in their eyes betrayed an entirely different devotion. The interior of the house revealed more. Pews fashioned from raw lumber filled the central space, worn not by worshippers but by restless movements of bodies gathered for reasons unspeakable. The pulpit stood as the centerpiece, a towering structure of blackened wood where Thomas Hudson delivered his sermons. His voice, deep and commanding, could make a stranger believe in anything. Yet his words carried undertones that unsettled the attentive, references to fire not as punishment but as liberation, to blood not as sacrifice but as offering. The hymns that followed were sung in slow, almost mournful tones, harmonies heavy, with something closer to lamentation than praise. Beneath the pulpit lay the first true secret of the building. A narrow hatch, disguised as part of the wooden flooring, led to a stairwell descending into shadow. Here the Hudsons created their hidden chamber. By lantern light, the walls revealed paintings not meant for holy eyes, crude depictions of rituals, figures in hooded robes, and symbols foreign to Christian doctrine. Skulls, both human and animal, rested on shelves like trophies, their sockets staring at intruders with eternal accusation. In the center of the room stood a heavy table scarred by knives and scorched by candle wax. To those invited, it was an altar. To those taken, it was a prison. The Hudsons used the guise of hospitality to lure victims. They would open their doors to wanderers, traveling merchants, or desperate souls seeking comfort. A weary traveler might hear the toll of the church bell at dusk and feel reassured by its familiar resonance. The Hudson matriarch, Eleanor, with her soft smile and gentle demeanor, offered food and drink. Children of the family, well rehearsed, would recite innocent prayers at the table, creating the illusion of wholesome piety. Yet beneath the floorboards, lanterns flickered in readiness, and shadows moved with anticipation. What unfolded after sundown was never recorded in detail, but fragments whispered by survivors and neighbors pieced together a grim pattern. Guests who entered did not always leave. The Hudsons justified these disappearances under the veil of faith, claiming that some had chosen to join a higher calling or wandered off into God's wilderness. Yet locals noticed belongings resurfacing in curious places, rings, boots, and traveling cloaks worn by the family without explanation. The Hudson property grew mysteriously rich in material wealth, even though no honest trade could account for it. Neighbors who dared question too directly were quickly silenced by fear. The Hudsons held sway in the community, not merely through intimidation but through a subtle manipulation of trust. They would host public gatherings, masquerading as revivals, where outsiders were invited to witness displays of fervent devotion. Thomas Hudson would preach fiery sermons about salvation, warning of the dangers of sin and corruption. His words struck with such force that many left convinced of his righteousness. Few noticed the sharp glances exchanged among the family, the way their hands lingered on the guests who stayed after nightfall. In private, the Hudsons were said to enact rituals that mocked the very faith they imitated. The bell tower, with its resonant chime, was sometimes struck at unnatural hours, its tolling echoing across the valley long after midnight. Those who lived nearby swore they heard chanting carried on the wind, low rhythmic voices rising and falling like waves. Some claimed to see flickering lights through the stained glass, red and gold as though the very walls were aflame. But whenever officials investigated, the family staged perfect displays of piety. A Bible sat open on the pulpit, bread and wine, laid out in simple reverence, hymns ready on their lips. The most chilling element of the masquerade was the use of confession. Travelers who stayed were urged to unburden their souls before rest. Thomas Hudson, acting as confessor, would sit in the dim candlelight and coax secrets from his guests, fears, sins, desires, This information was later used against them, whether to manipulate, shame, or select those most vulnerable for the family's darker purposes. Some confessions became twisted entertainment, repeated and mocked during the rituals below. In this way, the Hudsons fed on both spirit and flesh, draining not only the lives but the dignity of their victims. Over time, a paradox emerged. The Hudsons' false church became both feared and revered. Some desperate souls continued to visit, believing it to be their last hope for redemption, while others avoided it entirely, whispering warnings to travelers on the road. The house itself became a landmark, known more by reputation than by sight. It stood as a trap disguised as sanctuary, a net cast for the gullible and the weary. The deception endured for years, shielded by silence, fear, and the Hudsons' uncanny ability to shift between faces of piety and monstrosity. And yet, despite the precision of their masquerade, small cracks appeared in the façade. A guest would escape in the dead of night, pale and trembling, spreading stories of what they had seen. A farmer's son, curious and reckless, claimed to have spied strange figures through the stained glass and later disappeared without a trace. Whispers turned into rumors, and rumors began to travel farther than the Hudsons' influence could reach. Though no direct evidence could yet condemn them, the masquerade was beginning to unravel. And in the shadows of that unraveling lay the chilling truth that the Hudsons' church was not merely a place of false worship, but a machine designed to consume, a stage upon which the family played saints by day and demons by night, their sins hidden behind hymns and their crimes disguised as salvation. The Hudson family's Sunday gatherings had always been painted as holy, sacred events, moments where scripture echoed through the walls and prayers supposedly ascended to the heavens. But by the 1870s, those same gatherings began to resemble something entirely different. It wasn't just the frequency of their services that raised eyebrows, it was their exclusivity. Outsiders were told that only chosen souls could attend, that the family alone understood the mysteries of salvation. Behind closed doors, however, the chants grew darker, and the sacred became profane. Whispers told of how the sermons no longer lifted spirits, but instead seemed to suffocate them, twisting faith into something unrecognizable. The stained glass windows, once seen as artful reminders of God's light, seemed more like colored filters hiding shadows no one was meant to witness. The neighbors noticed subtle changes first. A strange candlelight flickering at odd hours, sometimes long after midnight, when the church should have been quiet. Visitors arriving in black carriages, faces hidden under veils, slipping inside without knocking. Some claimed to hear faint music, not the solemn hymns of worship, but rhythmic pulsing notes that carried a sense of something forbidden. The air around the Hudson estate began to feel heavy, as if the soil itself had soaked up secrets and refused to let them go. Dogs barked at the gates and refused to go near, while children were warned never to wander past the hedges that shielded the building from prying eyes. The Hudson patriarch, Elias, explained it away whenever townsfolk dared ask. He spoke of midnight prayer circles, of healing sessions for the brokenhearted, and of exclusive study for those devoted to deeper truth. His words were always delivered with a smile so calm it disarmed suspicion. Yet those who did not attend could never shake the way he locked eyes with them afterward, as if testing whether they believed his lies or whether they might soon be silenced. By 1873, rumors had swelled into full-bodied tales. A stable boy whispered that he saw blood-stained linens carried out the back door and burned in the yard. A washerwoman told of voices not reciting scripture but groaning in anguish, echoing through the walls during these midnight sessions. Merchants noted that Elias Hudson began purchasing unusual quantities of wine, oils, and herbs, quantities far beyond what any household, even one that hosted gatherings, should ever need. And then there were the disappearances. 2 young women, seen entering the church on separate evenings, were never seen again. Their names were spoken only in hushed tones, as if uttering them too loudly might draw the same fate. The house itself seemed to embody the duality of the family's deception. By daylight, its façade radiated respectability, with polished wood, clean windows, and a well-kept garden that suggested order and discipline. But at night, lanterns within cast strange, shifting shadows across the windows, like figures moving, in silent ritual. It was said that those brave or foolish enough to peek through cracks in the shutters caught glimpses of masked faces, of men and women kneeling before Elias as he raised a chalice high, his voice commanding yet alien. Locals debated what exactly was happening inside. Some insisted it was simply indulgence, wealthy men satisfying desires under the guise of religion, using prayer as cover for pleasures of the flesh. Others whispered of something far darker, of rites that desecrated both body and spirit. The most chilling suggestion of all was that Elias Hudson had created a place where sin itself was sanctified, where the boundary between church and brothel was deliberately blurred until neither could be separated from the other. As months passed, fear began to grip the town. Even those who had once admired the Hudson family kept their distance, avoiding eye contact when Elias walked through the marketplace, his black coat swaying like a shadow that swallowed light. No one dared challenge him openly, for it was said that those who crossed the Hudson soon faced ruin, or worse. A farmer who spoke out against them lost his livestock mysteriously in the dead of night. A merchant who refused their business found his store set ablaze. People learned to lower their heads and hold their tongues. The irony was inescapable. A building that claimed to be a church, a house of God, had become a house of fear. Its steeple rose above the town as if pointing to heaven, yet those who lived beneath its shadow felt only dread. Mothers clutched their children tighter when passing by. Men who once boasted of their courage avoided its gates. Even the bells, which used to ring joyfully on Sundays, fell silent. The Hudsons had no need for bells. They summoned their congregation in whispers, in secret, in shadows. And yet, despite the terror, curiosity festered. Human nature could not resist the temptation to know what was hidden. A few bold souls, driven by anger or desperation, tried to uncover the truth. One such man, a carpenter who lost his sister after she was last seen entering the Hudson church, crept to the grounds one autumn night. He swore later that through a crack in the shutters, he saw Elias holding court over men in fine coats and women in silks, their faces lit by candles placed in a perfect circle. He claimed the air was thick with incense that smelled not of holiness but of decay, and that the prayers he heard were not prayers at all but chants, their cadence rising until it felt like the walls themselves trembled. Terrified, he fled, never daring to return, but his story spread like wildfire. The townspeople now faced a paradox. They lived alongside a family whose wealth and influence shielded them, whose reputation was carefully maintained, yet whose house reeked of secrets, too foul to ignore. But what could they do? To accuse the Hudsons publicly was to risk being ridiculed or destroyed. To remain silent was to become complicit in the sin festering behind the church's walls. Thus, the Hudson estate became a legend in its own time, whispered of by candlelight, feared in daylight, and avoided altogether after dusk. Those who walked near it swore they felt unseen eyes watching, that the air grew colder as they passed. The house did not merely sit on its foundation, it loomed, pressing upon the conscience of the community like a curse. The Hudsons themselves moved as if untouchable, cloaked not in holiness, but in the power of secrecy. By the mid-1870s, the Hudson gatherings had transformed from mere scandal into a sinister mythology that seeped into every corner of the region. And the most terrifying thought of all was this: perhaps Elias Hudson wasn't simply corrupt. Perhaps he wasn't merely greedy or lustful. Perhaps he believed with every fiber of his being that what he was doing was sacred, that he was not mocking God, but serving him in ways too advanced for the common mind to grasp. That, in the end, was what chilled the townspeople the most. Not just the acts themselves, but the conviction behind them. For when sin is performed in secret, it can be condemned. But when sin is proclaimed as holy, there is no limit to the darkness it can reach. The Hudson family's transformation of their hidden chapel into something more sinister was not abrupt, nor was it obvious to the eyes of the townsfolk who still occasionally glanced at the isolated property from a distance. At first, the building retained much of its holy façade. The steeple remained, The bell still rang at odd hours, and its doors were polished with care as though welcoming prayer. But those who ventured close enough, usually travelers lost along the unlit roads, would notice the subtle shift in tone, a carved angel above the doorway whose features seemed sharper, less benevolent, more watchful, windows once adorned with saints now frosted with grime, making it impossible to peer inside, lanterns that flickered in red hues rather than the familiar yellow glow. The Hudsons maintained a performance of piety, but what lived within those walls was something else entirely, something spoken of in hushed voices in nearby taverns and never mentioned openly within the church-going town square. Rumors grew louder. In the winter of 1874, when two merchants vanished after supposedly spending a night near the Hudson estate. They had been traveling between towns with goods and coin, their disappearance initially blamed on highwaymen or the rough wilderness. Yet whispers suggested they had been drawn toward the house, mistaking it for sanctuary, and never emerged again. These disappearances, coupled with others stretching back years, became stitched into the family's legacy like a dark thread woven into fine cloth. What gave the rumors weight was the uncanny silence of the Hudson family whenever questioned. They were courteous, polished, and pious on the surface, their words smooth as scripture, but their eyes betrayed something else, an alertness, as if they lived perpetually guarding a secret that must never escape. The duality of the house grew, clearer when a young woman named Margaret, fleeing from an abusive household in a neighboring county, sought refuge there. She later confided to a confidant before her sudden disappearance that the Hudsons had offered her a room, food, and a bed, but the conditions were strange. She was forbidden to leave her quarters after nightfall. She was asked, almost ceremonially, to repeat prayers not found in any Bible, prayers that invoked shadows and silence rather than light and salvation. She told of a gathering in the chapel where the pews were filled not with the faithful, but with a select group of men and women whose faces she could barely make out in the candlelight. They wore no crosses, but instead pendants etched with obscure, looping symbols. The sermon that followed was not about salvation, but about obedience. Obedience to something unseen, something that required secrecy and sacrifice. Margaret's confidant would later recall her trembling voice, the way she clutched his arm and begged him not to tell anyone. She feared reprisal not just from the family but from whatever power they seemed to serve. A week later, Margaret was gone. Her belongings remained in the room she had rented in town, but her body was never found. Some believed she had returned. To her family, others whispered she had been claimed by the Hudsons. The local sheriff shrugged it off as the wandering of a troubled girl. But to those who connected the pattern, Margaret's vanishing was another link in the chain, binding the Hudson name to a growing legend of corruption disguised as sanctity. The townspeople's unease deepened with strange sounds drifting from the estate on moonless nights. It was said that if one walked the road past the property in the dark, they would hear chanting rising from the walls, a droning low tone interrupted by bursts of something harsher, almost like laughter. Some swore they saw flickering shapes through the stained glass, shadows moving against impossible angles, as though the building held far more bodies than the town itself could account for. A local farmer, emboldened by drink, attempted to approach with a lantern to catch sight of the activity. He staggered back into town at dawn, pale and shaking, muttering that the walls of the chapel breathed like a living thing. He never spoke another word about it, and within months his farm was sold off after he left without farewell. The Hudson family themselves only seemed to grow wealthier and more untouchable. Their coffers swelled mysteriously, though they had no trade, no crops, no visible industry. The only explanation that made sense was whispered in the dark, that travelers drawn by the bell or the façade of sanctuary provided both the offerings and the bodies needed to sustain their hidden order. Some locals even speculated the family had influence beyond their land, perhaps in the courts or churches of distant cities, explaining why no law ever pressed too hard into their affairs. The Hudson name carried an air of both fear and reverence, as though crossing them was not only unwise but dangerous to one's soul. The legend of the hidden house of sin masquerading as a church became a story parents told their children to keep them from wandering too far into the night. Yet beneath the cautionary tales, There remained the unsettling truth that no one could disprove the family's corruption. Each time the bell tolled, some shuddered not with reverence but with dread, for it seemed less like a call to worship and more like a lure into something unspeakable. That bell, heavy and hollow, was said to toll not by human hands but by the will of whatever force the Hudsons served, summoning the lost and the vulnerable into its embrace. By the close of the decade, the Hudson property was avoided altogether, marked on no maps and unmentioned in polite conversation, but its shadow lingered. Whenever another disappearance marred the county, eyes turned, quietly, furtively, toward the old chapel and the family who maintained it. And though no townsman dared storm the gates, each knew in their hearts that behind those doors lay not a house of worship, but a theater of control, where ritual and faith were twisted into tools of entrapment. The Hudsons had mastered the art of appearance, cloaking their sins in holy cloth, turning the very symbol of salvation into a mask for domination. And as the years stretched on, the question was no longer whether the rumors were true, but how deep their roots ran, and how many souls had been claimed within the darkness of their so-called church. If you've made it this far, you already know this story was never meant to be heard. Tales like these, shrouded in secrecy, buried under centuries of silence, and hidden from the public eye, are the very heart of this channel. We pull back the veil on forgotten crimes, forbidden histories, and mysteries so dark they leave echoes in the present. But here's the truth. This is only the beginning. Every week, we bring you stories that have been erased from textbooks, whispered about in journals, or deliberately concealed by those in power. If you don't want to miss the next hidden chapter, one that might make you question everything you thought you knew, then now is the time to subscribe. When you subscribe, you become part of a community that refuses to accept the surface version of history. You're not just watching, you're uncovering. And if you found this story unsettling, thought-provoking, or even maddening, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment below. What disturbed you most about the Hudson family secret? Do you believe the truth was fully revealed, or is there more still buried in the shadows? Your thoughts aren't just comments. They shape the conversations we'll have in future investigations. So, before you go, hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and leave your mark in the comments. Because the past is darker than you realize, and the next story might be even closer to home than you'd like to believe.